Kia ora koutou. We'll now reconvene our Strategy and Finance Committee meeting. We've just heard that our last submitter has withdrawn, just as in the last minute, so which means we'll now go to item 9, which is the amendments to the Traffic and Parking Bylaw 2018, summary of submissions, and invite Stacey Solomon to come and report, and she's the policy analyst. Page 59 of our order paper. Kia ora, Stacey.
Anei, ahi marie kai kanihira. Stacey Solomon, Policy Analyst. Happy to bring you the summary of submissions this Council has received on the proposal to amend the Palmerston North Traffic and Parking Bylaw. Very briefly, providing the background to this, the committee will recall the impetus for this work came from the community at the end of 2021, specifically residents, business owners and neighbours of Works Road in Longburn, who expressed frustration with ongoing nuisance issues they were experiencing with street races. Similar examples were then received from other areas of the community, requesting that Council address the issue. The Council chose at that time to respond to the requests of the community with the support of the police by amending the Traffic and Parking Bylaw. The amendment itself is intended in the first instance to be preventative by enabling the police to issue instant infringement notices to people operating vehicles in contravention of the proposed bylaw controls. So this is preventative in that it is intended to take effect before vehicles are able to congregate en masse in those very, very large groups that we heard about from submitters today. It's also worth noting that the bylaw is not proposed as a standalone solution to this issue. It is intended to be an additional tool for the police to use to address street racing. The next part of this process after today will be for staff to provide detailed advice to the May Strategy and Finance Committee on each of the submissions received to inform deliberations at that time. So I welcome any questions from the committee.
Great, thank you. First off, Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to clarify, am I able to ask questions about the bylaw itself or just about the submissions to the bylaw?
I'm open. Go for it.
Okay. Thank you very much for the report, and some of my questions may not just be within your scope, but firstly, we've had a lot of concern through the submissions about people who actually work on these streets. So I'd like to ask, if you did work on Bennett Street, say, for example, which exception would you fall under? Would you need prior written consent from council, or would you fall under the exception, apologise, I'll just get the list up here, would you fall under the exception of a motor vehicle, trade or service vehicle being operated for the provision of sort of maintenance utility of the road? I don't know. It doesn't seem like there's a space in there for people who are working on that road.
I suppose my answer to that particular question is that clause 10.4, which has been proposed, that would include the exceptions for people who have business on that road, that are using that road as a way to get to their place of work.
Yes, and so perhaps it's a question for our legal counsel if they're online as to which of those clauses it would be, because my read of them, perhaps that a motor vehicle is being used for the execution of duty might be where, I just feel like it's important we know to be able to tell our community with confidence that vehicles which work on the street will be allowed to use the street. Doesn't seem clear under the items.
David Murphy, did you want to have a comment or response?
Yeah, I guess some of these interpretation or application issues can, no problems with them being flagged, but we can address them when we report back on submissions with any recommended amendments to the final bylaw. But that, we'll take note of that question and can clarify in the report back.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And my other question related to page 65, where theme 4 was there was some concern regarding the legality of a bylaw control. I imagine we've done that work as to whether this is legal. And could we get some comment from our legal counsel if they're online or if they're not here?
Pardon me? Yeah, the officer can answer that.
I can hopefully provide an initial response to you. We will be able to provide a more specific answer to your question in our follow-up report for your deliberations. At this point in time, we have sought legal advice, and that has concluded that the council is able to implement these proposed bylaw restrictions under section 22AB of the Land Transport Act.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr Chair.
No problem. Thank you. Councillor Michelard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Stacey, for the report. I think my question is largely around the proposed timing for the prohibition times that's outlined in the report, 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. How did you guys come about with choosing those times? Because from the submissions that we just heard, a lot of submitters have also told us that there are different times of the day that boy racers would be there on a particular street at 7 p.m. or 8 a.m. in the morning. My question, I think I'm just trying to understand, how did you guys come about in agreeing with these times?
Those times were proposed with the advice of the police, as well as considering other councils who have similar restrictions implemented. The hours then are ideally intended to apply to people who may be there for antisocial purposes, to street race, but to exclude people who have a reason to be there during their day through the course of their business. So the 9 to 5 traffic won't be affected.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kia ora, Stacey, thank you. Just wanted to understand in terms of the next report back, will that be able to traverse some of the issues raised around potential kind of displacement of the antisocial activity, and as well the risks and potential benefits with expanding the number of streets included and potentially going as broad as a blanket?
Yes, we will be able to provide that advice in the next report.
Great, thank you.
Right. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Stacey. Just have a general question, I suppose, about submissions. I noticed there was at least one submission with what I suspect was a fake name, and I just wonder, what the rules are around fake names, anonymous submissions, that type of thing. How do we deal with those?
We are able to, we accept submissions from anybody in the community. We do have some, I suppose, guidelines in our privacy statements around people who choose not to provide a name for publication purposes. So we always have a name that people can choose not to share with everyone else, though we know who they are. In terms of those fake names, and there were a few that came through this consultation, we don't really have any control over that at the point of where the person is making their submission, though we do take the content of their submission into consideration as we do with the others.
So how would we know then, for example, that it wasn't the same person under making multiple submissions under fake names? You know, it does, I don't know, it called into question in my mind how reliable the process is when you can see that sort of thing going on.
It's perhaps a question better answered by one of our website staff.
If I could just clarify,
Sure.
Hannah just had a word to me and confirmed that when submissions do come in, we do check that they're from a legitimate email address, rather than sort of a robot sort of firing through random submissions under random names. And there's obviously a checking that there isn't a whole lot of anonymous submissions coming from the same email address. So each submission is tied to what we consider to be a legitimate email.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Thank you. There's no further questions. Thank you, Stacey. As Chair, I'm happy to move the recommendations on the screen, seconded by Councillor Naylor, and open it up for any comments or debate. I'm just going to lead off with some comments. One is to say that this has certainly emerged as a fairly hot topic, and you can tell by the number of submissions. So one of the things around whether it's fake names or otherwise, most of them are legitimate residents that are happy to put their name to a submission, and there's been quite a number. And recognising for and against, but on a large scale, I kind of wait personally with the feelings that have been reflected both through the submissions themselves in the hearing today around the concern of safety and peacefulness in residents, and even around the commercial environment. So the submissions themselves did raise some issues for us to consider when the report comes back to us around the limitation of how many streets we've actually included in the current proposal versus a number of streets that have been suggested or recommended, right through to a blanket coverage across the city. So that's something to consider. I think the question around hours is another one, because what come through the submissions is clearly that it doesn't matter what time of evening or morning or whatever, it's an activity that kind of eventuate or can emerge without any real anticipation. So that's another challenge for us. But some of the high-level reflections that I've got from today, and look forward to the report coming back to us. So thank you. Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I just wanted to make two brief comments. One was around thanking our officers for all the work that's gone into this, particularly the number of submissions that we've received. It was a lot of reading, but the summary very effectively sort of pulled through the key themes of those many submissions that we read. So thank you to our officers. Regarding my line of questioning, reading through clause 10.4, there's provision there for owners and visitors, for maintenance vehicles, for that kind of thing, but there doesn't seem to be a specific provision for those accessing that road for commercial purposes. Now, I would hesitate just saying those employed at a business which operates there, because you have external companies that may supply to companies on that road, but perhaps a clause around legitimate commercial activity could be seen as strengthening and alleviating some of those concerns that many of our submitters raised, that they just want that assurity that their staff and their contractors will be able to utilise that road between those hours. My other was around, and I didn't ask this in a question then, which I possibly should have, was around how difficult it will be to add additional streets to this, and I'd like to see some analysis around the length of time that will take and whether or not we can have specific provision in this that enables reasonably quick addition of streets, because as we've all discussed and we're all aware, this is a band-aid solution. It won't fix the problem across the city, and it will likely move people from one industrial area to another, and so the ability to quickly react to that, even with temporary provisions to enforce this bylaw on streets that aren't currently listed, would be, I think, quite positive, because otherwise we might take these few streets off the menu but put an equal amount back on it that, if it takes us another year to respond to, is going to make this completely ineffective. I think the issue of local versus regional buoy races is also an important one to consider. A large number of the issues we're facing are the invasions that we're getting from Lower North Island buoy racing troops, and in my mind, the strength of this is disrupting them wherever possible and making it more difficult for Palmerston North to be a city they attend to. At the end of the day, that will shuffle the problem potentially to other areas, but we're here as a Palmerston North City Council to look after the people of Palmerston North, and if we can make our city as difficult as possible for buoy races to get around, then I see that at the very least as not being a harm and potentially having some good benefits. So thank you to the officers, and I really look forward to reading the report that comes back to us.
Thank you. Councillor Hancock.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Chair. I'm not going to go into any great detail in terms of my comments today. I'll leave those for the more substantial meeting as the process proceeds. But I was heartened by the large number of submitters that took the time to submit, most of whom are in support of the proposed bylaw. And I suppose with various submitters, we really need to underline and stress the anxiety and distress that has been caused to many residents through the behaviours of this group of people. This is not designed as a standalone solution, but it's an enabler in terms of allowing the police to be more preemptive in terms of their management of the situation. without having to, I guess, commit large numbers of staff to deal with the various issues. And I noted that Inspector Ward talked about taking a prevention and enforcement approach to managing the situation. And of course, this sits firmly in the preventive as well as the enforcement sphere. So I'm very happy to support the resolution before us, and I look forward to this advancing to the next stage. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yes, I just wanted to comment on the added value that having a large number of submissions has given us in this particular process, because I think a wide variety of perhaps previously unexplored points have been brought out through the submissions, both for and against, that hadn't really been explored prior to it going out to public consultation. So I do think that has been a very useful consultation process. And the summary of submissions summarises quite nicely the different points that have been raised. And I'm hopeful that when we get the final report back that those points will be addressed, because I think there were some fairly sobering comments made in those submissions and what we've heard today, both from those who've experienced the I was going to say inconvenience, but it's way more than an inconvenience. The adverse effects, I guess, of having their streets in front of their houses and businesses being taken over by street racers, from the admission from police that at times they're outnumbered and unable to enforce the law, to the submissions from those who most notably didn't appear to speak to us today, but who would appear to have some connection with the street racing community, who suggested, that we would be antagonising and likely to cause a reaction from that community if we were to put some laws in place. So it does seem to be a very fraught and polarised situation, and will require some quite nuanced thinking, I think, when we come to do the bylaw. So I'm very hopeful that officers' report back will take all of those points, as I say, for and against into account, so that we can come to a reasonable solution at the end of the day. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Hapata.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. This is a very distressing situation for many people that have to experience this in our city, and it's very tough for many people to come and speak to us, and they find it very hard. Thank you to the officers for putting this report together. As everyone else has said, the summary of submissions was very good. It's very good to hear people in person when they can speak to us, so I do appreciate those people that have spoken to us today. I'm also looking forward to getting the report when it comes back to us for the bylaw, but it is also going to be quite a tough thing to enforce, as we all know. Enforcing bylaws is tough, but going forward is the best option for us. So thank you very much to the officers for doing the work they've done to date.
There's no further speakers in the queue, and so with that moved and second, I'd like to invite a vote. That's passed unanimously, 12 votes for and none against. Members, that now will bring us on to a second hearing, which is in regards to the Railway Land Reserve proposal to grant a lease to Tecton Limited. Before we invite our submitter to present, we have one that will be presenting online. I'm going to move the recommendations on the screen to resolve that the Strategy and Finance Committee hear submissions from the presenters who indicated their wish to be heard and support their submission, and 2, that the committee note the procedures of the hearing and submissions as described in the procedure sheet. And I'll move, seconded by the Deputy Chair, being Councillor Naylor, and invite a vote. has passed. 12 votes for and none against, unanimously. Before I introduce our submitter, I just outline our process that each submitter will get 10 minutes to present. Please take your written submission as being read, and you can feel free to speak to any aspects within your submission or any others relating to the topic. And that 10 minutes does include questions from members. So the floor is yours. Can I introduce, this is submission 17, Carl Ratahi of Zipline Technologies. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Am I clear?
You're very clear. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, my name is Carl Ratahi from Zipline Technologies, and I've designed and installed approximately 125 plus challenge ropes courses and climbing towers, commercial zip lines and military training courses within New Zealand, the Pacific Islands, Asia, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, and a number in the USA. I'm a member of the Association for Challenge Course Technologies, and I'm a technical expert with the audit standards for New Zealand health and safety at work in regards to adventure tourism. And I just wanted to put my point across as far as what the benefits of having a challenge ropes course within your community or within your town. I've worked in the industry since 1996, whether that be as a facilitator or a co-owner or doing the physical work myself. And the pleasure that you get from watching groups of people go through a challenge ropes course, whether it be children at risk or corporate clients or families, sports teams, the benefits that they get from using a challenge ropes course or a similar activity can't be explained, and it goes away from the actual structure itself, excuse me, and goes back into their home life or their work life or their school life or whatever it may be, and all of the learnings that they get from using a challenge ropes course or similar just gets growing further and further into their everyday life. So I think it would be a massive shame if Tecton wasn't able to operate in the Manawatu anymore. I think that the far-reaching benefits socially are just incredible. I don't really have too much more to say other than that. I think that, but I'm really prepared to answer some questions.
Great. You've got plenty of time for questions. I'll open it up for members to indicate if they have any. I'll go to you, Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Carl. Just interested, given that you have significant experience in this industry, for us as a council, if we're looking at proposals, what would you say would be some of the key points or key indicators within proposals that we'd want to be alive to in terms of judging their viability and value that they might bring to a community?
Well, I think you need to look at the post-activity scenarios and see what happens within the school, within the workplace, or within the family life, and see what they take out of their experience of using a challenge ropes course and see how it improves their life in general.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Right. Is there any other questions that members have? There are none. Thank you very much, Carl, for making the time to present today. There's no further inquiry from our members. Thank you. Great. So we have now moved and seconded and heard those submissions. So that leads us now to invite Bryce Hoskins to come and present the relevant report, which is the proposal to grant a lease to Tecton Limited, summary of submissions. Floor is yours. This is item 8, page 51.
Yes, thank you, councillors. Happy to take this report as read. For context to the papers that I presented earlier, and using the same analogy, I suppose this is step 2 in the process. As per the resolution council provided, we went out and we've been doing, did some consultation with the public. This is simply a summary of that. This, by no means, in accepting this report, is anchoring us into anything, nor are you making any decisions as part of this report on whether the high ropes course NNA licence is granted to it. That will come in a future report coming up, which will also accompany things like a business case and business plan and the likes, to which you requested as well. Happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you. Are there any questions from members? Go to you, Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr Chair. Thanks, Bryce. Do we have the facility to put any conditions on the lease around the frequency or the number of times the course is used, say in a year or?
We are able to provide some, I'll call them expectations around opening, I suppose. Lease agreements, or in this case a license agreement, typically aren't great around usage or some of those softer things, but we can provide some expectations around we would expect it to be open X number of times in a year and the likes, and we can also provide a little bit of direction around some of the outcomes we might be trying to achieve.
So when would be an appropriate time to discuss that? Would that be when you bring the report back to council from this?
Correct, and
Yeah, okay.
in accompanying their report as well, we'll also be providing some proposed lease terms, and that can cover off some of those things as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hapeta.
Thanks, Mr Chair. Just on 3.3 about the social media posts, I just wanted to ask a question about that.
Sure.
Just so some of the reactions, there was 4,108 engagements, and of that, only 143 likes. So would you say that was a successful campaign in terms of this compared to others?
Well, I'm limited on any kind of comparison to others. At risk of giving an opinion, I think this consultation did exactly what we wanted it to do in terms of it. We engaged with the public, we got their feelings. I mean, interestingly, if you look at the summary in the table in 3.2, even some of the comments that we've considered as against actually mirrored some of the conversation that was in the council chamber anyway, which was around they weren't actually against a high ropes course. They were actually reflecting the fact that they either weren't aware that it was there or it hadn't been opened, and I think that mirrored that conversation. So look, to answer your question, I believe it was successful, but ultimately it will be council's decision of whether you choose to proceed or not.
Yeah, I probably was referring more to the social media rather than the table above, but thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Bryce. Just a question around the next steps. As indicated in 5.2, says that the next edition of the report will provide a business case from Tecton Limited. I just wondered, would there be any analysis provided around that?
Probably rather than a business case, it's probably more of a business plan, which was something that was requested of the tenant, and actually that'll be provided directly from the tenant, talking about what they would be looking to do moving forward and how they were looking to operate their business, as opposed to a business case as it's said in there, which I suppose is more of a viability report that I think is a different matter entirely.
Great, thank you. So now that we've clarified that it'll be a business plan rather than a business case, really interested to know if there will be any analysis around that to support our decision making.
We can provide some analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I just had one question, Bryce. I'm not sure if you're able to respond. Really reflecting off one of the submissions, which was the Railway Land Action Group, gave a bit of a timeline of where things took place as a bit of background. And it highlighted the fact that the decision from council was made in the September of the year 2016. And yet if you go back 5 years back from the lease, it's going back that the lease must have been signed around February 2018. So almost a year and a half gap from the council decision to starting the lease. Was there a reason why that time frame passed without installation or activity?
Well, I wasn't at council at that stage, but yes, there was. Basically, from the resolution, there were a number of things that needed to be worked through from the tenant's point of view around actually getting the business ready to open, basically. So from that resolution, really, they were unable to do much of that until they actually had a resolution they were able to pass, and most of that time, as I understand it, was used doing those kind of activities.
Okay, I can accept that. There's no further questions. Thank you, Bryce.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. I'll move the recommendations before us. Look for a seconder. I'll go for Councillor Barrett. Open it up for any comments or debate. There being none, I'll now invite a vote. Thank you. That's passed, 12 votes for and none against. Okay. Thank you. Our next item, which I'm going to move from the chair, which is item 5, the petition, which is the overutilisation of land, Kainaora housing development of 16 to 24 South Street, Palmerston North. I'm going to refer that to council meeting on the 5th of April. I can do that as the chair. That does not need a vote. And that's agreeable to those that are presenting that petition. To outline the balance of the day, so everyone can understand where we're jumping and changing, and I appreciate everyone's flexibility and the hop and stop style of fitting in hearings around other business. But we're going to go and complete the quarterly performance report. Thereafter, we're going to do the item 12, which was the speed management plan. We may break depending on time frame, and then we're going to have item 4, which is a public comment that relates to Waterloo Crescent item, and then ultimately we'll have item 15, which is the Waterloo Park exchange land proposal. So that's the line of sight that we're embarking on for the rest of the afternoon, and we've already committed that we won't need tomorrow's reserve day for any business, which should be pleasing not only to us as members, but thrilling for staff equally. So well done already. I don't want to pat you on the back too quick, but let's carry on with the progress we've made. So therefore, we've had the questions to this item already. I'm going to move from the chair the recommendations to resolve to receive the memorandum, which is that report titled Quarterly Performance and Financial Report, period 31st of December 22, and related attachments for information. And the committee recommends that the council approve a new operational budget of $500,000 for this year to be funded 100% through the Better Off funding. I'll move that, seconded by Councillor Naylor, and open it up for any comment or debate. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Let's vote. I've moved in second. Oh, sorry. Let's debate. I'm very excited. Let's debate. Oh, you want to debate this? Go for it. Councillor Naylor, floor is yours.
Just a brief comment. Just really want to thank the officers for a really good, thorough report that gives us a lot of really good quality information about a very wide range, all of council's activities. I think a couple of things I just do want to talk about briefly. One being the capital program, the $25.4 million that has been delivered of a $112.4 million budget is some progress, but leaves about 87 million for the second half of this financial year, which is clearly not an achievable amount to deliver, particularly given what we have experienced over the first part of this year. Whilst 20 million of that has already been identified as by officers in our annual budget, I guess what I'm observing is that even 67 million for the second half of this year is well well and above what is probably going to be realistic to deliver. So I think it's really important that we are very mindful of the potential level of carry forward that will mean over and above what's already been identified as we consider over the coming months next year's annual budget. And this is a pattern that we have seen for a number of years now, and I think will only get minimised when we opt to adopt a more realistic capital program. The other quick comment I did just want to make is in regard to the capitalised labour, and I had some questions around that, which I understand is about 9.4 budget for this current year. The relevance of us being really mindful to look at how this is tracking relates to the fact that we're not going to be delivering the full capital program. So it's really, I do think it's going to be important for us to understand and perhaps watch how this is treated. I've had some very reassuring answers from officers in terms of the fact that we will only incur debt on programs that are actually being delivered. But in terms of the fact that we've got 1 million unfavourable in that area already, and only about 400,000 favourable to offset that in the remuneration area. I think we do need to just see how that tracks over the year, because it's going to be important that we don't, we need to watch how that is obviously something for the Chief Executive and officers to manage that situation, but I think as elected members we need to understand what that looks like, and in particular for our planning going forward. But a big thanks to officers for a very good report.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr Chair. A couple of comments. First on the general comments on the report, and then a couple of issues in the report. First of all, I thought it was a very clear report. I really liked the clarity that we had around the capital budget spend. I really liked the clarity we had around the FTEs and the staffing, which is new and to be applauded. So that's well done, very well done. Secondly, I am concerned around around the difficulties that we're having in progressing, meeting the KPI of having enough zoned land for residential and commercial development for the next 3 years. And so I have put in an additional recommendation around getting a report back to find out what the barriers to achieving that are, whether they be resources, whether they be actions that we need to complete with other organisations. But I think we need a really clear line of sight here on what it is that's required to achieve this KPI. You know, we've all acknowledged that housing is a priority in the city. And I am a little concerned that, for instance, one of the consequences of the reduction in operational spend that was passed through council in the consideration of the budget may result in less budget available for paying technical experts, for example, for this kind of planning work. So if that's the case, we need to be really clear about that, so there's no unintended consequences. And if we're not providing enough resource, or whatever it is that's required to achieve this KPI, then I think it will be helpful to know what it is, whether or not it's achievable, and so on and so forth. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that coming back. And then just my final comment is around the library figures. So it was mentioned to me in the break that the trends that we're seeing in the library around more use of the digital collection and less in-person visits are reflected across the country. So it's not just a change here in our library, it's a national change, and I think it'll be an interesting one to watch, particularly as we're thinking about our redevelopment of cultural precinct, but also in terms of planning going forward, so just to highlight that. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Councillor Bowen, did you want to speak as the seconder? Thank you. Councillor Barrett?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a general comment. I think that'll touch on the range of matters here. I don't think we're in contentious territory. I do support this additional recommendation. I think while it was appreciated that the Chief Planning Officer is willing to provide a report, I think it's quite helpful for us as elected members to be clear around scope and what we want to see covered in that. So thank Councillor Johnson and Bowen for bringing that option to us, which I will be supporting. As others have said, really do appreciate the quality of reporting here and a huge amount of work that will have gone into that, particularly in the performance measure areas. Really having quite comprehensive narrative to support that is wonderfully helpful for us, and I think helpful for the community to see what is being achieved with the investments that council makes, and was particularly heartened to hear as well in the questioning, the response from the Chief Executive around the timing of the notice of requirement. That is a question that I have tired of asking, and it looks like there may be an opportunity for me not to need to ask it again. So I'm really excited about that finally coming to fruition. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Barrett. Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to speak very briefly on the additional resolution that Councillor Johnson's put forward. I've asked a number of times as to what resourcing is needed for us to get our plan changes through. And we've heard today there are a number of different reasons for that, but I think this report is quite important as we go into annual budget decision making, because for me, if the answer is we need another $2 million, I'm not suggesting that we'll just blindly say yes to that, but we need to know what the challenge is so then we can then make decisions based around that challenge. If the problem is Kia Order and other government departments are paying planners $20,000 more and we can't get them, and we need to put another $400,000 in the wages budget to recruit planners and pay them $20,000 more, then tell us so we can make that decision. I think it's been really, not frustrating, because I haven't been here long enough to be frustrated, but it's been really interesting hearing things like, oh, well, Kakatangata, we've just made the internal decision to delay that. Well, I would like to know what resourcing is needed for us to get that done as we have plan change, massive changes to the Resource Management Act potentially in our headwinds. We've got significant competition for staff and for planners. It is crucial that we make these changes for the sort of next 20 to 30 years of our city and to provide that land for housing growth. And it's one of those ones that for me is a non-negotiable. I'm not prepared to kick this one down the road for another 3 or 4 years, and we'll worry about it when we've got enough available resource to do so. So I just want to be really clear in terms of what I'd like to see from this report, is I would like to see what the problems are, what the cost is going to be to fix it, and then we can make that decision as to whether we're prepared to make that investment to fix it or not. But if we don't know it, it's just internal decisions that get made to defer and delay and to move resource around, which I understand why those decisions are made, but I would like to see it up front so we can give our team the confidence that we're backing them if that's the decision this council chooses to make. So really looking forward to seeing this report, and thank you, Councillor Johnson, for putting it forward.
Thank you. Just as a chair, I'd just like to make a couple of comments myself. I'm comfortable with this recommendation and propose to put all three together, unless somebody asks to have that one put separately. I've liked the illumination that's been included in this report around how many staff we have, full-time equivalents, for example. Also the detail around capitalised staff budgeting. What sort of figure we're talking around in that space. And they're just examples of what's coming through now, which I really value and appreciate. That brings clarity to where we're at, and so we make better decisions moving forward. And I guess this is another frame, this recommendation that's been put before us around actually being informed and actually having the chance to make the decisions around shaping our future for our city. Councillor Hapara coming in, final speaker.
Thank you. This measure one was one that I wanted clarity on originally, and my point that I raised in questioning was around having clarity on the different areas of the city, and I think this measure basically lumps everything together. I think Councillor Johnson's recommendation is basically looking at resources, but my questioning was around having all of the growth plans in the one measure. So really having it all in a paragraph doesn't really help us understand the transparency, and that's what the officer said he was going to give us, and whether we need a recommendation for him to give it to us, I still don't actually think we do. But at the end of the day, if we have that through a recommendation, we'll get it through a recommendation. My second point is around Measure 5. The officer said that roading and footpaths is still, got a red on it, and his reasoning that he gave us was that it was to do with the software, that we're still getting quite a high red mark on that. Well, if it's a software problem or it's a contractor problem, I'd like to know the difference between the two, because I feel like sometimes it's more of a contractor problem rather than a software problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No further speakers. I'll now invite a vote on all three recommendations for clarity. That's passed unanimously, 12 votes for, none against. Members, we now move to item 12, as outlined earlier, which is the Speed Management Plan endorsement of scope and draft objectives and policies. I invite Peter Ridge to come and present, who's our who's our Senior Policy Analyst. Pardon me? Okay. And Peter might mention this, but we also have consultants from GHD, Charlotte French and Becky Young online to assist to answer any questions if required.
Through you, Mr. Chair, can I also invite Hamish Vickenby to join us at the table?
Certainly.
Kia ora koutou. While I'll take the report as read, I think it's probably useful to have a brief summary of why we're here with this item. So this is the first step of a new process for setting speed limits. Previously, we set speed limits via a bylaw. The new setting of speed limits rule, which was adopted by Waka Kotahi in May 2022, changed this process. So we no longer have the ability to set speed limits via a bylaw. Now we must make a speed management plan to set and change our speed limits. The new process is much more integrated than previously. If I can direct you to page 186 of the agenda, you'll see a very simple diagram there that shows how the different parts of the speed management process work together. We're not the only people making speed management plans here. The Regional Council is involved, and so is Waka Kotahi as a road controlling authority. So our work forms one part of the speed management process. The Regional Council has to produce a regional speed management plan, and it has to do this by June 2024. So our SMP, our speed management plan, effectively forms a chapter of the regional speed management plan, along with the other councils that are contributing their own chapter. So we're developing our SMP independently, but we're also coordinating with the Regional Council and the other councils and working to ensure we take a consistent approach as far as possible. And at the same time, Waka Kotahi are developing their state highway speed management plan, and we're engaging with them on those interactions with our own plan. The timeline on page 187 shows how we're planning to complete the work. So as you can see, we're at the start of the process, and we're aiming to complete our part of the work by the end of this calendar year. The reason for this is that it allows us to provide the information to Horizons for the regional speed management plan, with enough time to consult on any changes that might need to be made before their deadline of June 2024. So what we're here today is to seek your endorsement of the draft objectives and policies that are contained in Attachment 1, which we'll be using to assess speed limits that we will be including in the speed management plan. We're also asking for your endorsement of the scope, so the areas that we'll be looking at when we do those assessments. With those two elements endorsed and accepted, we can then move to the second step of the process, which involves undertaking that technical assessment and bringing back to this committee a draft speed management plan for approval for consultation. I'm happy to take questions about scope and draft objectives and policies. We've got Hamish here to answer questions about those technical elements regarding the scope. We also have Charlotte and Becky online, I believe, to assist with any of those questions as well.
Great. Thank you. We'll start with Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our officers for this report. I'd like to start on page 188, regarding city and town centre speed limits, including Ashurst and Bunnythorpe. I just wanted to understand the rationale of including Bunnythorpe in there, given it's a very different style of urban centre to Palmerston North and Ashurst, as to why that's been included in lowering to 30 kilometres as well.
So in terms of scope, when we looked at this, we were looking at all of our city and village centres. At this stage, nothing is predetermined, so it's not to say that we would make any changes to Bunnythorpe, but we wanted to include them as part of that holistic approach to looking at slower speed limits around our built-up urban areas.
And so if we didn't want to include Bunnythorpe, what would you like us to do today?
So the whole scope is very fluid at this point. If you think we shouldn't include something there, we can take it out. If you think there's something we should include, we can add that in.
Right, thank you. On the next page regarding neighbourhood speed zones, I recall when I did the survey for this, there was mention of Highbury being a test suburb. I see that's been taken out for this report. Was that due to feedback, or was that just we're not at the stage where we'll be prescribing zones yet?
At this stage, we had one or two suggestions. Highbury was an example of that. We're happy to take guidance from elected members here today if there is a particular neighbourhood you think would be worth including. The reason we mentioned Highbury, and Charlotte may like to add to this, is that our sort of very early assessment is that it's a fairly self-contained neighbourhood where that approach could work, but again would be needed to be assessed. If Charlotte wants to add anything to that, possibly through you, Mr. Chair.
Sure. Floor's yours, Charlotte.
Yes. Yeah. Hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Yes,
Can
very
you
clearly,
hear me?
thank you.
Testing. Can you hear?
Yes, we can
Oh,
hear you.
fantastic. Sorry. Thank you. I'm travelling at the moment, so apologies. So yes, building on that statement is that geographically very well contained. It is also an area that would be very easy to implement a construction of speed limits at relatively low cost due to its level of containment. And it is also an area that we are loosely aware of some community desire potentially for assessment of speed. We don't, as Peter mentioned, we're not at a stage where we can confirm if it will be required. But Highbury was an example of that. There are a couple of other residential neighbourhoods which meet this criteria, and as reaffirming what Peter just said, we are open to advice or recommendations from elected members if there is any particular community feedback for somewhere that would be a good first case or first cab off the rank, you could say, for giving this a go in Palmerston North. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Carrying on to page 195, it mentions at the top that speed limits for individual roads will be set with reference to their place within the Palmerston North strategic networks. So that is dependent on us passing the Palmerston North strategic network plan, and what would be the impact of us not passing that plan?
Possibly that's something Hamish can answer. When this was developed, we were under the expectation that that was going up to council, was going to be considered and potentially adopted. If it wasn't to be adopted, then we would be looking to find an alternative policy potentially. But the reason for including that there is the strategic networks provides a fairly comprehensive general framework for how we would look at individual streets. That's still, even though strategic networks as a document hasn't yet been adopted, the information that informs it is still in existence. So it relies heavily, for instance, on the One Network framework, that issue of movement in place, which identifies where streets sit in that matrix. So there's still information that we can use to help us assess that.
Thank you. And my final question, if that's all right, Mr. Chair, is regarding page 201, that talks about, under our what we want to achieve, increasing active transport participation to 15% of all journeys by 2024. What's the current figure? I apologise, I'm sure the other elected members already know that, but do we know if we're at 5% or 10% or 8, 2?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it's about 6 the last time we did a survey.
All right, and so we've got in here that we want to increase from effectively 6% to 15% in the next year.
If I could just add to that, those goals you're referring to are from the transport plan, which are the part of the strategic context that we're operating in. They aren't necessarily goals for the speed management plan that we're talking about here. this is where we've derived our strategic context for setting these objectives and policies.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you. Councillor Hancock.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. And thanks, Hamish and Peter. Just going on a little bit from Councillor Wood there, just in respect of the neighbourhood speed zones, I'm quite interested in sort of how these locations are going to be defined. And you've talked about sort of contained neighbourhoods versus ones which perhaps are less so. What's the criteria? How do we actually, because we may end up, I guess, with some neighbourhoods which are disadvantaged because they can't be defined, and how do we manage that in the out years?
Thank you for that. So I can answer part of that, and I'll hand over to Charlotte for the second part. So firstly, this is for the 2024-27 speed management plan. We'll be doing these plans every 3 years, so it's not a once and done. This is a first step, as it were. So any neighbourhoods that we may or may not include in this plan will basically be used as a test case for future work that goes into the 2027-2030 plan and so on into the future. As to the first part of your question about how we select which neighbourhood, I think that's a question that Charlotte's probably better answer. But we've talked about it a little bit, which is areas which you can delineate quite clearly, and because these will need to be signposted in a fairly effective and affordable way is probably going to be one of those key criteria. But I'll let Charlotte answer a bit more on that one.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. So I guess we are currently going through a process of essentially a multi-criterion analysis where we really try to focus on safety, the community impact, and just the feasibility of, and all those are kind of your high level headings, but all those elements that we've just talked about, the geography, the community desire, they all feed into this, and essentially the output of that will be a ranking of sorts at a very high level of when the neighbourhoods should be, and which ones are considered easy wins coming through first, and what will be probably the more difficult ones that you've alluded to potentially later down the track. And just building on what Peter's just said, is it is very much a staged approach. I've used this process for Christchurch City, who have recently just finished consulting on their later in the year going into their second plan. Their first plan had about 10 neighbourhoods, and the next plan, which will be capturing their 24 to 27 timeframe, is actually capturing the rest. And what we've found, it works really well, is it gives us the ability to have local data and local anecdotal evidence of the success that these can provide, which then can be used for the following potentially harder neighbourhoods that are maybe less well defined, or maybe we would love to it and really have that local data rather than relying on cities or places which aren't necessarily the same as Palmerston North. Thank you.
Thanks. I think I got the general gist of that. Okay, I'll just move on. My next question, I've just got two other questions. One is just around the intersection speed zones, page 190. And there's reference there, of course, to Wanaka Road and Pioneer Highway. And there is seemingly some very difficult tension to resolve between our greenfield development for Kekewhenua and Waka Kotahi's stance on the state highway network. Can we get some insights in terms of how that tension can be resolved?
Yeah. Do you want to comment?
Greetings, Council. Chris Lee, Activity Manager of Transport. We've had some recent discussions with Wakatahi about, I guess, future development for Kekewhenua and Kakatangiata. We believe that they're essentially wanting to have more of a structure plan around the developments before they can commit to any potential changes on the state highway, is my understanding. Basically, for them, it's a chicken or an egg game. Whatever comes first, yeah, we don't know, they don't know which one should jump first, essentially.
So are we the chicken or the egg?
If I could add to that, through you, Mr. Chair. So the Chief Executive and I actually just prior to Christmas visited Te Wanaka Road, Pioneer Highway with senior officials from Waka Kotahi to raise our concern regarding the speed limit. So certainly their technical officers were of the view that there wasn't a rationale to reduce the speed and pointed to some submissions regarding the role and function of State Highway 56 bringing freight into the city and things like that. So we made it clear to the, not so much the technical officer, but the senior officer of Waka Kotahi that our expectation is that there's been a number of public signals from this council and this community that we're proposing significant growth in that part of the city, and the zoning of land in the district plan should be, in this case, the chicken. And the egg is reducing the speed limit. So there seemed to be a suggestion that there wasn't a clear chicken or signal for development, and we challenged that and said, well, the zoning of land, which has occurred, should be the signal to reduce the speed limit. Their view, well, part of their view was, well, when development happens, you can then justify that to reduce the speed, which we disagreed with. So there are ongoing discussions with Waka Kotahi on that matter. That's the reason why we put this in the scope of this, because it would be this piece of work, because it's a further way of, I guess, highlighting it to Waka Kotahi that our expectation is that the speed will be reduced.
And through you, Madam Chair, if I could just add one more thing to that. This new process is different from how we've set speed limits in the past, whereas before we set them via a bylaw and speed limits effectively came into effect immediately. This is a 10-year focus with a 3-year implementation plan. It gives us the ability to put into a plan changes that will come into effect over those 3 years, and that can be another way of strengthening the signal. This is where things are going to happen.
Okay, I'm not sure that that's really given me any sort of comfort at all, really. But anyway, so my last question really is just around, it's page 200 where we look at the regional principles and objectives. And if we look at the bottom left box there, which is supporting our well-being, and that's about enabling equitable access to a variety of safe and healthy transport options and generate public health, accessibility, environmental and amenity co-benefits. And then we actually look at our transport plan and we have a look at our purpose. And that is to provide an integrated multimodal transport network that connects people and goods with destinations in a safe, efficient and sustainable manner, and evolves to meet new transport demands with less reliance on private motor vehicles. I just really want to seek a comment in terms of whether or not there's a misalignment there in terms of what the regional plan says, which I think is quite emphatic in terms of moving to multimodal, safe and community wellbeing kind of benefits, and ours is kind of sort of more centred around sort of the moving of goods and people across our network. So I just want to see if we've got a comment about that.
I could help out there, I think. The first thing is, if there is a misalignment, then the review of the LTP provides an opportunity for us to review all strategies and plans. So I think actually when we considered the strategic networks document a month or two back, we talked about the fact that there's never a point in time where every single transport document is reviewed at the exact same time. So certainly what Peter and the team have done with this piece of work is had to build up, I guess, the evidence based on the current strategic direction, whether that's the GPS, the regional planning documents, or our own. So every 3 years we review all those, and there's an opportunity to realign. So certainly if there is some concern about the purpose of the transport plan, then we can look at that as part of the LTP. As Peter said earlier, this document is not reviewing that, it's pointing to what those existing plans and strategies are saying.
Yeah, notwithstanding that, this is all about principles and objectives, and if there's a misalignment, I guess now's the time to perhaps highlight those.
Is that a question?
Question mark.
Okay. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair.
Don't try the patience of the chair, Councillor. So I've got 3 questions, really. The first one, I guess, is a kind of more of a big picture question around how we are bringing the community with us on this idea of, reducing speed limits, but also in having what seems to me to be a variety of speed limits at different parts of the city at different times of the day, potentially confusing for people, I would have thought. So how are we engaging with community to see if this is what people want, rather than perhaps in the chamber determining that this will be a good thing and sending it out there?
So that's a good question. So this piece of work is actually part 2 of a multi-stage process. The first part is the interim speed management plan, which focus on speed limits around schools. That was supposed to be brought to an earlier meeting. It's been deferred due to workload, so that's coming actually on the 5th of April now. That would have given us an opportunity to, if it had occurred when we expected it to kind of lead some of the conversation around speed limit changes. And we're aware that, excuse me, around the country, a lot of councils are changing speed limits, and there is a lot of discussion about what speed limits should be set at, whether it's for state highways or motorways or local roads. Taking that approach with the interim speed management plan was our sort of first gambit, as it was. Unfortunately, timing has worked against us, but we are still working to have that conversation within the community. We have a website that's already launched, which is providing some general information around speed limits. We've done it as a soft launch because we don't currently have anything approved for consultation, but the idea is to provide some basic information around the speed limit process for the community. When we go out to consult formally on the interim speed management plan, we'll be including more information, including some videos to help explain the rationale and the justification for slower speed limits, particularly around schools. For this piece of work, once we get approval for these, for the scope and for the objectives and policies, we can start doing some early engagement on speed limit changes in advance of a formal consultation document. So one of the things we want to do is take a rolling approach to engagement. So as we work through the scope and we do the technical assessment, we can start testing some of those ideas with the community and get some early feedback, which will feed into the proposal that we bring back to you for approval for consultation.
Okay, thank you. So how will we achieve these reductions in speed? Will it be through changing the dynamics of the street? Will it be just through putting up a sign and hoping that the police enforce it? How are we expecting to be able to, actually make this happen, as opposed to saying that this is the speed on this road?
So I'll hand over to Chris in a moment to give a general answer to that one in the first place. It'll be a mix of things. It won't be one thing or another. One of the new features of the speed management plan process is that we're required to include programs for infrastructural change that relate to speed management. So that's something that was never required before, but is required now. And what that means is we'll be looking at the speed limit changes that we're proposing and identifying the programs that will go along to support it. The second part, though, is that for our very first speed management plan, we're trying not to set our goals too high and set ourselves up for failure. So a lot of the changes we're proposing are ones where speed is already at a fairly close level to what the speed limit would be set at. So for instance, the operating speeds around the CBD are already close to the speed limit that we would probably be setting it at, meaning the actual infrastructural change is minimal, and there may be some minor changes needed in certain parts of the network. But I'll hand over to Chris to talk about that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So if speed limit changes got approved, the first stop would be the installation of signs and speed limit signs. Where we've lowered the road, say, and there's a differential in speed, we'd be looking at things like traffic calming and traffic calming treatments like raised platforms to help get those speeds down. It wouldn't be delivered on installation, but we would be planning it through long-term plans and have a progressive program and rolling it out through the city. We'd probably prioritise, key key land uses or areas first, such as where there's, I guess, a higher need or desire, such as around schools, just as an example.
Okay, thank you. And then just my last question. Have we defined what the city centre is or what a village centre is anywhere?
For the purposes of this project, no. And we've talked about scope in fairly general terms. We want to give an idea of the things we're looking at rather than specific definitions. One of the things we'd be looking at, for instance, with the Palmerston North, the main urban area, the city centre, is what would be an appropriate boundary to set a lower speed limit. And it could be slightly larger or slightly smaller than what another definition may be. But rather than confining ourselves at this point, it's giving ourselves a general target rather than a specific limit.
Okay, I understand that, but you're asking us to sort of approve this plan, but it's quite vague.
We're asking for an indication of scope.
Okay.
So the scope is the city centre, a lower speed limit around the built-up commercial area, I guess you would describe it. But rather than saying Pitt Street versus Church Street or a specific delineation, we're looking for a general indication of support rather than a specific area. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Barrett.
Welcome back, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Peter, Chris, thank you as well. Couple questions remain. One does relate to scope as it's indicated in paragraph 3.4188. Perhaps just my reading of the list there, but it seems a list of things that are kind of more and less contentious. What requirement is there on us in terms of scope that we set out in this initial plan? Like, how did we kind of get to that list?
We've developed this list based on internal discussions on areas where we feel there is either a really strong case for a relatively uncontroversial outcome. For instance, the city centre is an issue that's been discussed for a while. It was discussed during our last major review of the speed limits bylaw, but it was deferred because at the time it wasn't felt it was a clear case. And we've also seen how those discussions have panned out in other cities where they've looked at reducing speed limits around their city centres. There are a number of what Chris may describe as like urgent or high need roads, so a few of those have been included there. And this is where we believe there's an urgent need to reduce the speed limit. But generally, we're looking here for your support, and if there are changes you want to make to the scope, then we're certainly happy to include those. And I should state that this doesn't presume or confirm that changes will be made, but merely that these are the areas that we'll look at. And we'll bring the proposal back to Council for approval for consultation at a later date.
Great, thank you for that. Second question's just around how the policy is set out at the end of that policy document. So I think it's page 204. Yeah, page 204 in the agenda talks about the draft speed management policies. And I suppose this is kind of my interpretation of them, but they seem kind of input driven rather than kind of output or outcome driven. And I'm just wondering about is that a deliberate decision to kind of frame the policy around inputs rather than around outcomes?
Yeah, it is quite deliberate. We're operating in an environment where there's a lot of directiveness. The Speed Management Guide, which is another document published by Wakatahi, sets out a lot of criteria that we need to follow in terms of technical assessments. There are a limited number of speed limits that you can actually propose. It's, in some cases, the speed limit that can be applied is one of two that we might have to choose from. So our scope isn't infinite in that regard. So what we're looking for are policies that are actually quite specific to scenarios that we're looking to target in this speed management plan. So, for instance, the city centre policy we put there is quite direct. It gives us a very clear guidance for what we are proposing to do. The ones around schools, similarly, this is the same policies that we would have applied through the interim speed management plan, and they give us a very clear direction as to what we're looking at. The outcomes, the outputs you refer to, are probably more driven from those objectives that we're trying to achieve, which are aligned to the strategic direction at both the national, the regional and the local level.
Great, thank you. Finally, Mr. Chair, just to ask if I can, Peter, around timeframes from here. You've signaled something would come back in August. If our view in August was that we needed an additional cycle of drafting before consultation, would there be time for an additional cycle of drafting before going to consultation to get us in line for 2024, or is today kind of our only real shot at this?
We would always do our best to accommodate any further changes, but to be perfectly frank, I think we are running very low on time. We've allowed about 3.5 months to complete the technical assessment work.
Yeah.
For the scope that we've outlined. We think that's about right. Obviously, more time is better. We can do more thorough work and investigation, but 3.5 months is about right. If there were further changes when we bring it back in August, depending on what those changes are, we may be able to accommodate them, but if they require substantial rework of the proposal, then we could be putting ourselves at risk of not meeting that December deadline.
Great, thank you for those answers, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Arnott, and then finally Councillor Hapeta.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a lot of concerns about reducing speed. Obviously, there's a lot of speeds that should be reduced too. My main concern...
Question?
My main concern at the moment is there information in this document that is now not applicable with the deletion of the government policy last week about reducing speeds on state highways to only now 1% of the worst?
To the best of our knowledge, the government announcement last week relates only to state highways, and the work that we're proposing here is for local roads. And as of this moment, we don't have any direction from Whakatahi that we should be changing our approach. We have spoken with the area program manager about that very point, and they've confirmed that we should be continuing as we have been planning.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Councillor Hapeta.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Peter. You're asking for us in the recommendation is to confirm the scope on 3.4. So under the scope, under neighbourhood speed zones, you talked about Highbury being one of those neighbourhoods. What are the other neighbourhoods you're wanting us to confirm as part of the scope?
Excuse me. I would suggest at this stage, given the scope we've already outlined, one neighbourhood would be a good starting point. If you disagree that Highbury should be the neighbourhood that we focus on for this plan, then we can consider another. Any other neighbourhoods would be addressed through a future plan rather than this plan.
Sorry, just trying to understand this, because you're wanting us to confirm, as the recommendation states, you're wanting us to confirm the scope. My question is, what other neighbourhoods do you want us to confirm? I don't understand how that's not clear, that question.
So at the moment, we are proposing the possible inclusion of one neighbourhood, not multiple neighbourhoods.
Okay, so it's one neighbourhood only, and that neighbourhood will only be Highbury.
If you select Highbury...
I'm not selecting anything.
If the committee selects Highbury as the neighbourhood they want to include, then that would be the neighbourhood we would go away and assess.
So what committee are we talking about?
This committee.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I'm pretty confused about what this is doing.
Can I try and provide some clarity? So you've been asked today to approve the scope and objectives. What we're recommending is that the scope includes a neighbourhood speed zone. There's been some suggestions that it could be Highbury, it could be something else. If you were to approve the recommendations as they stand, you'd be asking the officers to go away and look at what we think is the most appropriate neighbourhood speed zone to include as a first cab off the rank. So unless you provided more specific direction that it is Highbury or some other community, other neighbourhood zone, officers will go away and identify what we think is the best neighbourhood zone based on the criteria and direction from the various higher order documents.
Okay. My second question then is, how did we select these specific roads that are listed in this table?
I might pass it one over to Chris.
Most of the roads that we've listed have had some road safety issue, whether it's associated with a death or serious accident, or it's a road that's just known to be generally unsafe, like Kyohitara Road, where the current speed limit of 80 k's isn't appropriate for that road environment, particularly around in like the gravel section. Yeah.
So because they've had an accident on them, or because they've had something like that, that's why they've been selected?
Yes, there's generally been a what we consider a high road safety risk, which is possibly due to a crash, or it's there's no, I guess, low cost treatment to address the road safety risk. So the speed limit is considered the most appropriate option.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Wood, you've come in quite late.
Sorry, could I just ask one final question that's popped into my mind? So with regard to the Palmerston Strategic Network, that plan outlines a citywide speed management program to reduce speed limits on all urban streets to 40 kilometres. Is this the plan that would enact that statement? Or is that a different plan that will come to us later?
It would be through a speed management plan. It may not be as comprehensive as that in this speed management plan.
But long-term, that would be included in this,
long-term,
in the 10-year period of this plan?
Long-term, over excuse me, over a 10-year period or longer, all speed limit changes will be through a speed management plan.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. No further questions. Thank you to the officers. Thank you both, and thank you for also assisting online. Charlotte, appreciate it. Now move into the recommendations, which I'm happy to move from the chair, both recommendations, and look to a seconder, Councillor Naylor. Open it up to any comments and debate. Councillor Zebulon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to note I'm thrilled to see Kahutarawa Road and Summerhill Drive on this list, knowing that Kahutarawa Road is a single lane road, gravel, poor visibility, prone to slips, and is at times the only access to the Arapuki Park and the sledge track. So that's great news. And with Summerhill, I'm hearing that a lot from the residents, that the 60k zone up there is often exceeded in anticipation of the 70k change once you get up the hill to the state highway. So I think there'll be a lot of residents in there happy to see this included on that list too. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Yeah, I mean, I do have some reservations about this, I suppose, which I'll try and outline. I mean, I will support it because it's at an early stage and there's still work to be done on this, and then still public consultation. I'm personally not convinced that having what appears to me anyway to be a kind of series of different rules for different streets throughout the city will be very easy to get buy-in from the general public for. And also, I'm not also convinced that actually that kind of what appears to me sort of piecemeal treatment of streets will be very popular. Now, I might be wrong, but you know, in general, I can see the value in decreasing speeds, for example, in the CBD, for example, on roads that have got particular safety issues. But where you might be driving from A to B across the city through a couple of suburbs, and you've got to go through a 30 and maybe a 40 and then a variable one and then a something, I just think it's starting to sound quite complicated. So, you know, I'll be interested to see what public feedback is on this. And as I say, at this stage, I'll agree on it going out to be worked on further, and then we'll get some, we'll get it coming back later this year, and then it will go out for public consultation. But I just think with all of these sort of changes that require really buy-in from the majority of the community to follow these rules voluntarily, because we can't easily enforce them, that the community conversation is going to be very important, and getting buy-in from the community for these changes, I think, will be the most important aspect of it. So just leave it at that.
Thank you. Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't be supporting this plan, and I recognise I may not get support of my colleagues for this, but I have a strong feeling of discomfort in our entire speed, traffic and parking management plan that we're operating in this city. I do not feel it's in step with our community's needs or our community's opinion. Do I agree with our objectives, scope and policies in this plan? No. There's no goal in here of making our city easier to get around and less congested. There's no goal in here of improving the productivity of our network. In fact, there's a goal in here of slowing down our network, reducing efficiency and productivity across our city. There's no goal in here of actually making our roads safer. It's just passing the buck of unsafe roads down to reduce speed limits rather than better design of roads to make sure that they're safer for people to travel on. So there are bits of this that I agree with. Of course, we need to get heavy vehicles off of our domestic roads. Yes, the square should probably be 30 kilometres an hour. I mean, you can't travel around there much faster than that anyway at the moment, but should we be reducing Bunnythorpe to 30 kilometres an hour? Completely out of step with all other rural villages in the Manawatu region? Absolutely not. Should we have active transport as an option for people to use? Absolutely we should, and I agree with that. But this is not the right plan for a regional city of 90,000 people. The plan itself, even in its wildest dreams, if we get a single mum from Kelvin Grove biking from school to school and then going to work on Broadway, would only see 30% of our network by 2030 travelling primarily by, or 30% of our travel being by active transport, yet we're throwing out any sense of making our city more efficient for those in motor vehicles to get around, despite recognising that even at best, 70% of our population are still going to be using that as their primary method of travel. So I recognise the aspiration of plans like this, and I recognise the requirement that we have on us to reduce the speed limits around schools. Now, whether I agree, as Councillor Johnson mentioned, that if we have a 30-kilometre zone that changes to a 40-kilometre zone then through to a 50 just driving down Featherston Street, do I think people are going to follow that? Probably not, but at the end of the day, we are required by government to make that plan, so I respect that. But the rest of this plan, and I admit the Palmerston North Strategic Network does a lot of harm to this in my view, because that plan in and of itself, I have very strong reservations, and the community feedback I've had when I've said, did you know the city's looking at reducing over the next 10 years all of our speed limits potentially to 40 kilometres? The shock you see on people's faces if they knew what we were discussing in the chamber, if they knew the plans that we were talking about, is just beyond belief. I won't talk about parking, we'll save that for another day, but although there is merit to this plan, I have a significant level of discomfort across all of our plans and how we deal with vehicle travel in this city. We should be focused on making our city easier to get around for everyone, not just congesting our roads to artificially increase the number of people who are forced into using active transport because we've made our city so difficult to get around and so slow to get around. That's a stated policy within this plan, is that if we slow down our streets, it's going to encourage people or discourage people from using motor vehicles, which will artificially encourage them to use active transport. And I just don't agree with congesting our city on purpose through slower speeds to encourage active transport. So, and I recognise there are some benefits. I'm not saying this is solely without merit. There is a lot of merit to parts of this. But we have to have some sort of reality check of what the needs of our community are. And this, along with many of our other plans around parking, transport and speed, is just, in my opinion, wholly out of step with what our community's wants and needs are. So I apologise. I appreciate the work the officers have put into this, and this is no disrespect to the officers. I recognise this may have been a result of the direction you've been given in the past. So I don't say this with any malice toward our officers, but I just am not convinced this is the right direction for us to head down, and I would rather a reset of our scope, goals, policies and objectives. So that's why I'll be voting against.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good to see this come to the table. We have set out a strategic direction as a community around what we want in terms of livability, what we want in terms of safety in the community, what we want in terms of transport choice. And while change is at times challenging, this is a positive step towards delivering on livability, delivering on safety, and delivering on transport choice. So while I accept that there may be some anomalies within the scope, there may be some things that need to be adjusted by the time we see it in August, and there may be some things that we will want to adjust subsequent to community feedback. I think it's a prudent step for us to begin some work that actually does fundamentally deliver on those benefits of livability, safety, and transport choice for the community. Just judging from some of the comments that have been passed recently, I think we could probably do with a little bit of probably understanding of some of the drivers of congestion, understanding of some of the drivers of efficiency, understanding of some of the drivers of productivity in a city, and understand that you can't actually speed your way to prosperity. I think it's quite a robust mythology that continues to haunt us in a place where speed does a lot of harm, and we need to make sure that we're providing for our community well in terms of safety outcomes, especially in areas where we have road users who are particularly vulnerable, such as around schools, et cetera. So, absolutely hear those comments in terms of needing to make sure that we keep the community with us in terms of a positive and strong engagement style, and I hope that what comes to us in August is accompanied with some good material that we can really help communicate the broader picture to the community when we go for consultation. And finally would say, this needs to be seen as part of at least a tripartite solution. So we need some form of speed limit planning, but we absolutely need infrastructure to match and to see investment in infrastructure so that the road feels like what the sign says. And we also need the ability to see speed limits enforced if we're going to actually get anything out of this ultimately at the end of the day. So I see this as a step that is necessary in terms of delivering on those overall outcomes of livability, transport choice, and safety, but it is not in and of itself sufficient. So I think this is one important piece of the puzzle as we move forward, and would urge colleagues to support it so that we can get this work underway. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hapeta.
Thanks, Mr Chair. I'm going to vote against it, and it's basically for the reasons that when I asked the questions about how the scope was put together for 3.4, and yeah, I admit that some of these roads have had accidents on them, but some of them probably haven't. Yeah, I do agree some of the roads are pretty busy and some of them weren't having the speeds reduced on them, but I do feel that reducing everything down to 30 kilometres per hour for me seems quite a rash decision. I along with Councillor Wood, I just feel that this is not the right time to do it, and I just don't really support putting all of these in that bracket at the moment. I do think we do need to get some trucks off the big roads, and I think that's the right way to do it, but just putting this speed management plan in place with this scope in mind is not really what I think our community want at the moment. So that's why I'm voting against it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Colleagues, I think we need to be really clear what we're being asked for here today. This is the very beginning of a number of stepped process. This report invites us to make changes to what is proposed as in the scope and draft. And the next steps outlined on page 195, it says if the committee wishes to make changes to either the scope or the draft objectives and policies, then these can be incorporated via resolution to the recommendations to the council. What we are being asked to do is to confirm the scope and endorse the draft objectives and policies. If elected members are not comfortable with what has been proposed in this paper, then I would invite them to make some amendments and some changes to that, or if they have not formulated that for today, to consider that for when these recommendations are made to council. But this report tells us that we are required to adopt a speed management plan. We are not being asked for our opinion about what that is. What we're being asked for is to confirm the scope and the draft objectives. It is our responsibility to ask the community what they think. We do have a role in guiding that draft, but we're not being asked what we think the plan should be today. And so I do think if there are some changes, rather than simply just voting against this, I think we should be giving that guidance to officers to help formulate something to consult on that they're more comfortable with. So I'm also have a few reservations, but I'm happy to approve the recommendations. But also, I'm more interested to hear from colleagues constructive suggestions as to how this could be changed, rather than simply voting against something that actually we're required to do.
Thank you. Councillor Arnott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also won't be voting for this today and have quite a few reservations. Obviously, there's a lot of it I do agree with. 30 kilometres reduced, I think that's going to cause more accidents than trying to prevent, to be honest. I agree with a lot of what I've heard around the table. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hancock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Councillor Naylor, for breathing a little bit of common sense into the discussion. Look, we need to really stay in the moment here. This is part of a process going forward, and it's all about preparing things ultimately for consultation with the community in terms of the expectations around speeds around our community. I talked the other day about just as kids are all heading off to school, an 18-wheeler fully laden cement truck driving down Victoria Ave at 50 kilometres an hour with kids on bikes and things like that, and that is very unsafe. So as a council, we need to consider what it is that we have on our roads and how we should get ourselves around the city. I do also have some concerns, but of course, if we talk about Councillor Wood's reference to Bunnythorpe and 30 kilometres an hour and how that is ridiculous, well, that might be Councillor Wood's view, but I think we need to go and ask the Bunnythorpe community what they think first. So let's stay in the moment and not get ahead of ourselves. I have some concerns around neighbourhood speed zones. I look forward to seeing some suggestions actually come back to the committee and some objective viewpoints around that in terms of how we actually choose and manage that going forward. I also asked some questions around Te Wanaka Road and Pioneer Highway and the intersection there. And seriously, you know, we don't have enough greenfield development locations planned for in the next 3 years for the city. And then we've got Waka Kotahi, who's actually preventing that occurring and watering down 230 potential homes to somewhere around about 30, all for the want of a reasonable decision about managing our state highways and ensuring that our cities can have a growth plan which is sustainable and made for our communities going forward. And the last point I do make, which I think that there is a disconnect between the regional principles and our transport plan, and I urge our officers to actually have a look at that to make sure that if we really truly want people to use alternative modes of transport to get around our city, and it's a relatively small city, it's a very cyclable city, and it's a very walkable city. So if we actually want those things to occur, let's make sure we've actually got some lines drawn in the sand to make sure that we are very clear about what our long-term plan is for the city. So this is a good step in terms, this particular paper is a good step. It's not perfect, but I'm sure that council officers will actually take this away, do some more work on it, bring it back in a state where we are then asked as to what we should actually consult with our community on. So let's not assume what our community wants or needs without first going and asking them. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Bowen, and then finally our Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will be brief because I agree absolutely with the comments from Councillor Naylor and Councillor Hancock. Yep, I have some concerns about what's in, what's out, what's up, what's down. The important thing for me here, and it probably reflects back to the conversation we had at Council about the last lot of transport planning, is that we need to understand where our plans sit in that hierarchy of national documents. We're not the independent Republic of Palmerston North. You know, we sit within a national transport network with national transport rules that we're required to give effect to, and planning documents that we're required to bring forward in order to navigate that connection. And so, yeah, this is one part of that conversation, and absolutely, you know, delighted about some of it. I'm worried about the rest of it. And we'll go out to the community and talk about it. But the important thing is it's a piece of work we have to do. And so I'll be supporting it at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you. The Deputy Mayor.
Kia ora, Mr Chair and councillors. I too support Councillor Bowen, Councillor Naylor and Councillor Hancock. I do have concerns about this. In the weekend, myself and Councillor Barrett had the opportunity to meet with some cyclists, and prior to them going off, they made sure that they were quite clear to us about the dangers that they were facing every day. One of them had said to us that he actually has to plot his route and several times within a month and change it because it's so dangerous. Wherever he goes, he's looking for safer ways of getting around. And like Councillor Hancock, I too have been in my little car driving around, and next minute I'm jammed between two huge trucks, and I'm sort of thinking, crikey, you know, kids are on the road, lots of people are. So yes, I think this is an important process to go forward, and that I am looking forward to us seeing what comes out of this. I wouldn't suggest Highbury. I think if we're going to select an area for this, that we go somewhere where there's more than one school. I mean, I grew up in Highbury, so I'm sort of thinking, okay, I know the schools aren't close by, but go down Featherston Street if you're going to, where there's preschools, a primary school and a secondary school, if you want to get a good idea or an indication. That's my rationale for that. Because I don't think we'll see too much movement or too much of a difference, I suppose, if we just went there to a place where there's only one educational institution. But when you've got some fairly close to each other and on a busy street, that might give us a fairly clear indication. People might not like it, but that'll be the very busy part anyway, and give us some good feedback. That's my thoughts. Thank you, Mr Chair.
Great, thank you everyone. It's wide-ranging debate. I have no further speakers, so now I'd like to invite a vote. That is passed. 9 votes for, 3 against and 2 abstentions. Thank you very much. We will now go to public comment, which is the most interesting order of business we've had, and welcome you, Rosemary, to the table. Rosemary, thank you for accommodating us to come back, to come in this afternoon, having been planned to present tomorrow morning, but with our effectiveness to get through business today, tomorrow is not required now. So we really value your time and your flexibility. With public comment, you may know already you get 3 minutes to present, and there may be questions from councillors thereafter. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon all. I'm Rosemary Watson. I live at 27 Tilbury Avenue, and I'm a direct neighbour of the proposed land exchange area. I put in an email written comment to this committee, and I'm going to take that as read. But I thought I'd better come in as well to tick the box that I'm a human and not a spam bot. So, just to summarise, Tilbury Avenue residents value their existing buffer reserve strip, and we'd like for it to be retained as green space. So at this stage, we're urging your support for option 2 proposal. The proposed swap area doesn't seem equivalent in terms of true public green space, because some of it is destined to be car parking as opposed to greenery. The original buffer strip that we've got was created when Higgins extended their property into the catchment board area. But what would have happened if that strip wasn't created? In that case, how would an attractive River Park entrance for the new Roxburgh Crescent development have been achieved without the land swap? Just wondering what other options there are for this. Why should it be either one or the other reserve site? Pinching from Peter to pay Paul, why shouldn't it not be both and instead of this apparent loss of green space? Once the green space is gone, it's gone. We acknowledge the current buffer strip isn't as used as well as it could be, so we see an opportunity to remedy this, which wouldn't have been possible without the Roxburgh Crescent development, and that's to use that and the existing part of the Waterloo Reserve, potentially develop that as a community kai area in the neighbourhood, which doesn't actually have one at the moment. The buffer strip is integral in accessibility to that site from Ruahine Street, Roxburgh Crescent development, through out to the Scout Hall at Eyre Place area. Some of the criticisms of access before when the idea of a community kai area has been raised are accessibility. So in other aspects, the site's actually quite desirable. It's got good shelter, it's got water supply, it's got a toilet nearby, it's parking nearby, it's got good soil type. Community-led for community kai, we're starting the process, but it's more pertinent now than ever because there's all this new development of lots of houses on small sections around us who might be limited in what they can actually do to provide their own food. A couple of veggie boxes maybe, not much more. So it might, I'm just presenting this as an opportunity that may not have ever been considered and may be a viable one to actually use the area better, the current and the existing reserve space, make it a better quality of life for everybody through placemaking and kai resilience. And I'm trying to advocate at the moment, not only for us as existing residents, but for all those residents in the new developments that are currently not even here yet because the homes haven't been built. But we're trying to future-proof our environment, and I just figure that I need to speak out now to make these suggestions, and the retaining of this reserve strip at this stage is key to overcoming accessibility concerns for this site. And so I'm asking please support option 2 and investigating other options for enhancing the New River Park access at the Roxburgh Crescent development, and for some way to investigate due consideration of a kai production site in the area. And we envisage it to be more of an orchard or productive park rather than intensive vegetable growing or anything like that. So it's a walk through and potential for education facilities in the area as well of plant recognition, pruning, training and whatever. So that's about all I've got to say now. Thanks for the chance to present.
Thank you, Rosemary. That was very timely. It was about right for time. I'm going to open it up to members. There might be questions if you're happy to answer some questions.
I'll try my best.
Yeah. One of the things, if I can just maybe take a lead, on the current reserve strip, it doesn't have a street access from what I can gather. Could you tell me if that's correct or not?
It doesn't have direct street access. If you go past the Scout Hall on Waterloo Crescent, it opens into the car park in Eyre Place there, which has recently been developed by you guys and sort of sealed as a proper car park, and a toilet's been put in there as well, which accesses Eyre Place. So direct access to green space, you have to walk through a car park off the street if you like, but there is a route there.
Okay. Thank you. Deputy Mayor.
Kia ora, thank you very much, Fire, for coming along today. My question is, when you refer to a community kai area, are you talking about a mara kai, like a garden space, or multi-purpose?
We so far have talked about probably fruiting trees and shrubs, possibly a herb garden and a foraging area, with the idea that it's a pleasant walk-through area that community members can use and that local residents can actually maybe congregate in, and it's productive as well. It's a good use of land to produce fruit for the community nearby. and we envisage that proximity to the River Park entrance and the stop bank. Lots of people actually walk along the stop bank from Eyre Place through to the current Ruahine Street bend, and so they don't go down to the River Park at all, they walk along that stop bank. And so, you know, it's very accessible to walk along the reserve area, maybe instead of that loop, if it was opened up. You know, I'm not the planner at this stage, I'm just putting the, you know, I'm maybe trying to be a bit visionary about how it would work and suggest that it's an opportunity that, you know, it would be a good use of currently underused reserve land, but it is integral to retaining that buffer strip.
Yes, and I just want to know if you'd seen what they have off Buick Crescent, because they have what you've sort of described. You can walk by it, it's herbs and so forth.
That, no.
Just thought I'd let you know.
Oh,
as
I'd love
well.
to. Now you've told me about it, I'll go and have a look.
Kia ora.
Great, just two other questions, or people, three now. Councillor Wood and then Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Thank you for coming in and presenting, Rosemary. I just want to get a feeling of how widely your views held within the community, because some may say it's just those that border onto the reserve that get benefit from it, but I'm taking from your talk that it's more than just those who border onto it. You've spoken to other neighbours of yours across the street, that kind of thing?
I've spoken directly to the neighbours that border onto things. I've spoken in more general terms to some of the other people up the street, and it's really difficult to actually put the idea out too far at this stage with the spectre of the land being taken away from us and the whole thing just not being a starter anyway. I have had a few people telling me, in the language, oh, you're pushing poo uphill, trying to influence anybody. And I'm trying to say, well, if we don't actually try, we're never going to get anywhere. My aim would be, obviously, to canvass wider. Some of the immediate neighbours are going to be moving because their houses are going to be demolished in the new Kaianga Ora development in the area. That's replacing 4 houses on Tilbury and 1 in Eyre Place with 13 new developments, which are part of these homes that are going to be on much smaller sites than current, and part of the ones I'm trying to advocate for. I'm certainly prepared to put some foot traffic in, more foot traffic to go wider. If I need to do that independently, it's quite possible that that might happen in the consultative consultative process later on anyway. But yeah, time and effort, I'm prepared to street walk around the neighbourhood. That doesn't sound the best, does it? But yeah, I'm prepared to put the footwork in. This is a very initial stage. I haven't been able to think about even putting a presentation in to this committee until literally Friday, when I got confirmation back from both Horizons and PNCC that there was no site contamination issues in the 2 arms of the reserve area that we're talking about. Because if there had been, the community garden would likely have been a non-goer just from that base, or else very, very difficult to work around. So it's literally only now that I'm still putting this together, but lots of information gaps, I admit. But I'm here now to just put it out there that is there a possibility of saving this reserve land and improving the quality of the green space in the environment.
Thank you, Rosemary. So just to clarify, all those you've spoken to, even if they think you're pushing it uphill, do support maintaining the reserve, even if they don't just live next to the reserve?
Yes, basically. I haven't had anybody says, no, take it away.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett is our final member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Rosemary, for coming in. My understanding of the kind of layout of the land is there's that strip between your house and the Higgins property currently, but there's also kind of a strip between the houses and the stop banks that kind of run along towards the Scout Hall.
Yes, yeah, that's, both areas are in my PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, excellent.
The map that I sent you all out, this is the buffer strip area we're talking about, and this is the arm down towards the Scout Hall.
Yeah, great.
So potentially we've got linkage from here, and from here. And potentially, I've actually got a provisional discussion with Higgins, the Horizons business manager tomorrow, about maybe potentially doing something in the remains of the area that Higgins are not buying from Horizons along behind the stop bank there to get more area here coming down from the proposed River Park access as well. Very early stages in that one.
Yep.
I haven't mentioned that today because
Thank you.
really I don't know what's going on there.
No, thank you for clarifying that we're envisaging the same pieces of land. So I guess my question is around, kind of your aspirations around community garden and those sorts of activities and the potential viability of that if it was to be only available in the gap between kind of the houses and the stop bank, and it wasn't able to be made available in that arm that currently reaches in between your properties and the Higgins properties. What would be the impact if it was only on that other part?
I don't know that it would be assessed. You're saying if the land swap did go ahead and this piece of land wasn't viable. Is that what you're saying? If this wasn't there? In the past, I've been told that it wouldn't be recommended because of accessibility issues, public accessibility. It should be a public space and it's not very accessible. So I'm just promoting maybe a better way of trying to use both arms of that reserve better than they currently are.
Great, thank you. That does bring a point of clarity there. Can I also understand if there were to be multi-level houses built in that, in the Higgins land area, what kind of concerns you might have around shading impacts, kind of, turning that into a shade spot rather than a sunny garden?
Well, if that arm was there would be some shading, definitely, but with appropriate planting, you can find plants that will actually work well in different environments. I can suggest sort of some of the berry crops and things like that don't need full sun and could tuck away into corners. I've got guavas, small guavas and things in my own garden and cranberry type, lots of the smaller shrubby plants that might not grow where in shaded areas. Yeah,
Great.
That's very much up for grabs. I mean, I haven't planned it all out plant by plant.
No, I realize it. Thank you, Rosemary. Those answers have been very helpful, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Finlay, you come in very late in the questions.
Yeah, so when I saw the map, it triggered me. That bit of land that you're talking about, is that where the Relay for Life is going to be this year?
The Relay for Life, I believe, is going to be immediately, this year, is going to be immediately behind here on the other side of the stop bank. I think it's probably being accessed through the current Higgins access.
It is, yes.
Yeah. They, last time it was there, it was further along, but I think there's some silt problems from the recent flooding there, so they're putting it kind of here now.
So it won't be part of that land that you're talking about?
No, it's the other side of the stop bank.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rosemary. There's no further questions, but we will be moving on to the relevant item next, so feel free to sit in and hear the deliberations.
Thank you.
I'll move that the committee resolves that public comment be received for information, moved by me and seconded by Councillor Naylor, and put that to the vote. That is passed, 14 votes for and none against, which is unanimous. Our final item, item 15, which is the Park Waterloo Park proposal to exchange land. Kathy Diva-Todd, Group Manager for Parks and Logistics, to come forward, thanks. And Aaron Phillips, Activity Manager for Parks.
Thank you, councillors, for the opportunity to present the report. We're going to present it in two parts. I'll just give you some context, and then Aaron, who's been working on this project, will fill you in on a bit more of the details. So councillors, particularly those of you who might be new to this issue, there's two parts to it. One is the planning and the structure planning and the district plan conditions, and the other part is the Reserves Act process. So very much like Eddystone that you heard earlier today, an opportunity has been presented in terms of looking at the reserve considerations that the proposal that we have in front of us is for a land exchange, which means that as under the Reserves Act, we need to put that piece in front of you before you consider the structure plan or planning issues. So some of the issues that have been raised by the presenter relate to the planning part of it, and some relate to the reserve part. And really the focus of this this piece is just on the reserve part. The recommendation is such that we can gain wide community views on the proposal to exchange the land. If we don't want to exchange the land, then in effect, the Reserved Act process in this report is at an end, because we'll be just continuing with the status quo. And then the planning part would kick in and say, how are we going to provide for the amenity and the reserves planning within the plan change part, if I'm clear on that. Our recommendation is our best professional advice that this is the best overall reserve outcome for the public, but also that it gives you the opportunity to gauge the views of the wider public on this, including, as we did with Adderstone, where people came forward and said alternative uses and other things that you may consider as part of your decision making at a later report. On that, I'll just hand over to Aaron.
Good afternoon, councillors. I believe you've probably read this thoroughly, given the deputation of the public comment you've received. Don't have an awful lot to add, but just that the buffer strip at the moment is between industrial use and residential use, as it was shown in figure 2 on page 272, probably shows the area we're interested in most clearly. Like Adderstone, as Cathy has just articulated, we're seeking community views on the proposal before a decision is made. And we think this will add value. There was comment made about, from the public comment perhaps, anticipating a question about why can't we do both. Anything is possible, I guess. It depends on what resources council wishes to put into it. This proposal, we believe, will enhance the overall reserve outcome without needing to purchase land. If you wish to enhance the river entrance in the structure plan area and retain the land that we've got, then we may be in the situation of having to purchase new land as well. And presumably at residential land prices in a new greenfield area, so it would be reasonably expensive to purchase 1,000, the equivalent area of land, although it could be a different size in that area. Otherwise, happy to take questions.
Thank you. Open it up. Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to ask a question regarding page 276, where under option 2 you outline that the narrow strip of land would be left behind houses which would be undesirable from a safety point of view. I want to understand the difference between how this decision-making works now in relation to the planning that we'll do later. So if we did choose to retain this piece of land, we could then incorporate that as reserve into our planning and make it so it wasn't just an abandoned piece of strip behind a new set of buildings. We could incorporate it as a reserve, or is that not something we can do through our planning process?
The land in question that is a plan change is private land, so any discussion on how the land might be used is part of that structure and that plan change. At the moment, the proposed structure plan includes this land exchange. We can't sort of preempt what discussions may occur between the planners and the private landowner in respect to that.
But if we did choose to keep this section of land, we could build that into our discussions and of maintaining it as a reserve.
If we were to keep the piece of land, it is still in council administration and derived from the Crown. We couldn't incorporate it without going through a land exchange into any private development, and so we would still have responsibility for it. And we would have to, if you were to access it from the subdivision, for example, we would have to have some form of the public going from the subdivision, which would acquire a land acquisition.
Brilliant.
If I could just add to that, which might be helpful. If you look at the image on page 275, a logical development of the Roxburgh Crescent area will almost certainly result in houses backing onto the current reserve. So from an urban design perspective, it's going to be very difficult to incorporate this current reserve in a sort of safe and legible way into the development. So what we mean by that is I guess for it to become a legible or a reserve that people want to use, that's influenced significantly by the location and design of houses, but it's difficult to see anything other than houses backing onto that reserve.
All right, thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions from me. What's the approximate value of a 1,300 square metre area of land in that vicinity, if council was, if there was the requirement to purchase new land.
Councillor, through you, Mr Chair, I'd be speculating a little bit outside my expertise, and I don't know whether or not my boss's boss wishes to answer, or not.
In the spirit of being the boss's boss, look, it could be $350 a square metre upwards, really, depending on a whole variety of factors. It would have to be subject to evaluation if we were going to consider it.
Thank you. And just a question on towards the top of page 269, under the risks of option 2, the last bullet point there, in terms of reworking the proposed plan change structure, would be required, which may result in the loss of some of the wider plan change benefits. Can you just clarify what you're meaning by the wider plan change benefits?
So I'll just defer to the Chief Planning Officer on that, who's been dealing with the plan change.
Yeah, so if you look at the image on page 275, the way humans use public space is significantly influenced by the way in which things are designed and laid out. So the idea there is that middle road would be a key entrance into the residential area, and then there'd be a wide public space which then connects with the awa. So the whole idea is that you have I guess, public views over a public space. There's going to be a high level of interaction between the members of the public, the people in the houses, and the connection to the river. It's very difficult to achieve that same outcome with the current 1,000 square metres.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Operating off the same map on page 275, thanks for putting that in, quite instructive. It's just my kind of rudimentary understanding of how change of zoning to residential and kind of subdivision would work. If there wasn't the convenience of a 1,300 square meter strip adjacent, would it be incumbent on the developer to provide reserve space within a subdivision of this scale?
And the answer to that is not necessarily.
Okay.
We do look at the reserve provision in the wider area, and this is an infill rather than a new growth area. And sometimes it may be that a development in one area doesn't trigger the need for reserve, but that combined with other developments in the area, so like medium house density collectively does that. So each situation is different. This is next to a very large open green area, so you could argue, well, there's already enough reserve provision, but we need to look at them on a case-by-case basis.
And that hasn't yet been done in this case?
No, it has, Councillor. The decision was from the Parks Servicing Assessment for this area that we don't need what typically would be provided in a greenfield area, which is a neighbourhood reserve. The only aspiration we had in this area was to improve the connections to the Manawatu River in that space. There wasn't a need for a sports field, a neighbourhood reserve, a suburb reserve, or any other form of reserve that we would typically look at, for example, in Akautari or Kakatangiata.
Thank you. So then in the absence of this land exchange, we potentially get an outcome that's wall-to-wall housing and no additional river access?
There would be a river access. We already own a small strip of land, if you're looking at the figure that we've been referring to recently, figure 7, and it might be a little bit difficult to see, but the grey area to the left of the blue dotted area that connects between Street B and just below the word entrance, hopefully that's legible. We already own that. So we would get a much smaller access. It's, I'd have to check, but it's in the vicinity of a 5 to 7 metre wide access. That would be a small service vehicle access and pedestrian access rather than a wide, inviting environment.
Thank you. That's clarified for me. Thank you both, Mr.
Great.
Chair.
Thank you both. There's no further questions. Happy to move both recommendations on the screen, seconded by Councillor Naylor. Open up for comment and debate. Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and thank you to our officers for the work you've done in presenting this report to us today. I'll be voting against this, and if it does fail, putting forward option 2 as an alternative for a few reasons. First, I'd like to start with the need for more reserve space when we're creating medium density zones, not less, particularly reserve space on the city side of our stop banks. If Cyclone Gabriel's taught us anything, is that even in the depths of summer, our river reserve space can be impacted by silt. I know in my other capacity, my other roles, given we were talking about the Relay for Life, we've had to move it because of the silt that's been left on that space to further down the riverway. So I think it's important that we were talking about massive increases in medium density, particularly a medium density zone like this, that we do take into account the need for city-side reserve space. The alternative will be an access way, not a real reserve like this is currently at the moment. And yes, it's in disrepair. Part of that is our responsibility. You know, it talks about there being an infestation of weeds. Well, it's our land. So there's an infestation of weeds because we've let there be an infestation of weeds. And I recognise that's within budgetary constraints and everything that goes with it. But I'm just saying, if we look at this, not just as a strip of land there to buffer from an industrial zone, but as an actual reserve that can benefit the community there, the idea that all of our reserves have to have large, open sort of ways to get into them, go into Roslyn, go into Highbury, go into Hokowhitu. There's lots of small parks and reserves that don't have huge, large access ways to get to them, but do provide immense benefit to their community. So I believe if we incorporate the intention of retaining this reserve into the plan change and into our workings as we go forward, we can find a solution where it's both safe and productive for the whole burgeoning community that will be around there. I agree that we should do both. If possible, a purchase price of $350 a square metre, which I recognise is roundabout, whether it goes down to $250 because it's been industrial or whether it goes up to $450, depends on who you talk to and what, as our officer says, we'll have to go through a valuation process. But that brings you out to a cost of about $455,000, which in the scale of the budgets that we produce on an annual basis, $455,000 to provide additional purpose-focused reserve space for an intensified neighbourhood, I think is worth it. We have to be aware of the risks that we run just relying on the Riverside Reserve that's currently there. There is ideas, such as Rosemary's outlined, of potentially having a kai site, and I'm certainly open to exploring those possibilities. But I've been down there, I've walked that reserve, I've talked to neighbours in that community, and this is not what they want. And I don't think if you're going to be living on the third story of a new building when the river's flooding, that's going to be what they want, not having any access to reserve space in their local community. So I think we've got a reserve here. Let's not throw it away. Let's keep it and focus on building a community and building a neighbourhood down there that has both. Because what the new space will be primarily an access way, not an actual reserve where kids can kick a football around, can play, can have fun, can grow some kai. So I think if the cost was $2 million to buy the land, yeah, no, absolutely, let's go ahead with the swap. But we're talking $455,000 here, might be as little as $350, might be more like $550. So for the cost involved, I think option 2 is a far stronger proposal for the needs of our community and for the needs of the locals who are living there.
Thank you. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Once again, I just would like to point out the part of the process that we're in is not to make a decision about this reserve space, but rather agree to consult the community. And it's been really valuable to hear from one of our residents today, but that should not be seen as a comprehensive community view to inform our decision making. So I think I'm very happy to support this process. On the surface level, it does make good sense to me, particularly when, what is included in the report, particularly in 3.5, is that this current area has a low level of recreational value to the general community. There's 2 neighbouring properties that have gates, and if this was to change, they would just need to walk 265 metres to get to that river pathway. So, in the whole scheme of things, $500,000 I think is quite a lot of money, or $455,000 or thereabouts, or whatever it is, to consider what could be an alternate space that would give a lot more people access. So from that perspective, just on the surface, I think it's worth asking our community what they think about it more widely, and then us making a more informed decision following that consultation. So I'm very happy to support this.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Development and redevelopment kind of always puts stuff in tension, and I think it's wonderfully obvious for us here exactly the sorts of tensions that we do face, and very much appreciate the aspiration of neighbours and appreciate Rosemary's effort to bring to our attention. And I'd say if she's developed that since Friday, there's probably a lot more to come in terms of thinking about the potential of that space. But kind of, needing to weigh that alongside the challenges that we have in getting good development outcomes, especially the challenges that we have in getting good redevelopment outcomes out of brownfield sites. And at this stage, I'd be quite concerned to be introducing a constraint into what has to date been and will continue to be a delicate negotiation with the transition of Roxburgh from quite polluting, at least of the air, brownfield use into a much more pleasant housing development in the near future. So while I do have real sympathy for what the residents are bringing to us today from a very local lens, I would like to see that, as Councillor Naylor suggested, run through a process where we look at kind of wider input from the community around concerns that are and perspectives around that particular piece of land before we land on a final decision. So I am up for giving this an airing. While I do hear and share a number of the concerns that have been raised by the members that intend to vote against this, I'll be voting in favor of it so that we can get a wider range of views before coming to an ultimate decision. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm very much in favour of, in favour of this, the two recommendations. And I think my views pretty much align with what Councillor Naylor and Councillor Barrett have alluded earlier on. Whether we want to have an access way or something else, I think the purpose of this recommendation is actually to take us up in the community, consult them on what needs to happen anyways. And then that will, whatever we get out from that community consultation, will inform our final decision on this. So we're not basically making a final decision on this, but we're actually asking community input, gauging the community on what exactly they want us to do with this particular piece of land. Whether it's an access way, that's fine. Or whether we can use it for recreational purposes in the future, that's fine. But the purpose of this is basically to ask for community consultation so that they can feed us with information that will inform our final decision. So I'm very happy to support this, and I will encourage every other councillors to do so. Thank you.
Great. No further speakers in the queue. So therefore, I'd now like to invite a vote. That is passed 12 votes for and 2 against. I'd just like to thank everybody for their flexibility today, and particularly the officers being thrown in with very short notice to jump back and forth. The members, I appreciate your openness to kind of get through work with the chop and change, as I mentioned before, the hop and stop type of style of meeting we've had today. But ultimately, we've addressed everything and no need to come back tomorrow, so well done. And can I just call on the Deputy Mayor to close and karakia? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, colleagues, and also staff members and members of the public. I'm going to conclude with a karakia that basically says kia puta ki te whai ao, that we, to come into the world of enlightenment, ki te ao marama, that which gives us understanding, whakamaua kia tina, let's do it together. Haumie, huie, taiki, and be unified and supportive of each other. Kia ora, everyone. Thank you.
Kia ora. Kia ora. Thank you, Whai Debbie. And that concludes our business for today. I'll close the meeting. Thank you.